Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my Gameweek 26 cheat sheet. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list in FPL of all sorts of players based on their price point and positions, looking at how great they are for the immediate run ahead, taking into account more than the 3 fixtures that you see on the screen, but rather even the next 5-6 fixtures. Although from a fixture point of view, I also want to mention that a lot of people are loosely planning a wildcard 32. That's the most conventional strategy at this moment in time. That's simply because people are planning to dead end in Game Week 31, where we have a blank game week. So whilst we have a double game week this week in Game Week 26, which is exciting, we've got Arsenal and Wolves doubling. Those teams will blank in Game Week 31, and so will likely City and Crystal Palace in Game Week 31 too, as long as City continue to progress within the FA Cup. Now, from a fixture point of view, I think there's some pretty interesting transfers that people can make, but it all comes down to, what's a luxury for you or not, and whether you're able to kind of make those moves. As far as the cheat sheet, I think we've had some pretty radical changes, more so within the cheap price points of players, because simply put, there's a lot of diversity right now across, I think, specifically the midfield, but also the defender position. So let's jump into the cheat sheet. A lot of the stats here are all provided by OptaStats with the Fantasy Football Hub tool. You'll need to access Premium for that, but you can find it in the link in the description below. Probably one of the best tools in terms of all-in-one stats for FPL, which include some of the DEFCON stats as well, and a lot of other stats too that are very helpful in terms of assessing things like if you want to look at per start or, the average minutes of a player, that sort of thing. So let's have a look at the midfielders, as I said. I did want to sort of drop Douglas Luiz down a bit because I think I noticed a bit of an earlier substitution within the previous game versus Bournemouth, but I'm kind of hesitating on that. So I still think for the price point, for someone who should be close to touching DEFCON per game, has tools in his pocket like set pieces and penalties, I think he's still a really good pick just because the Villa run's so good. Dewsbury Hall, we actually gave him a rise a couple of weeks back just because, of course, he's back to playing, and I have liked the positions that he's taking up. He is just one of those players like Harry Wilson this season, in a sense, who has gotten lots of hauls. Bruno Guimaraes is quite similar. We are moving into a league almost where the more interesting, I guess, box-to-box players are doing exceptionally well because they also have, the additional set piece for the potential assist and of course, circumstances where you actually find them being quite good in open play this season where ultimately they can get that sort of upper ceiling of a haul. He also is utilized in different sorts of positions depending on, let's say, the specific tactics of this Everton team, sometimes even more advanced than usual. But yeah, Dewsbury Hall is just a very exceptional player. As far as Lefay, people might see him as deserving of a drop, but I think coming out of the Arsenal game, he's just on a generally decent fixture run post Liverpool. And this is, I suppose, a slightly weakened Liverpool as well. And, keep in mind, of course, the context is that Sunderland have been really good this season at home. So I think he's still a really solid pick. As far as the next tier, though, that's where a lot of people are, I think, starting to move that there's sort of fifth midfielder too, just because if you can kind of afford to own someone in one of these price spots, I think you're doing good. Not that Dewsbury Hall or Douglas Luiz are a massive difference, but it's just if you can stretch towards, let's say, an Anderson right now, I think he's still probably the most solid pick within all the midfield position, just because the baseline for the DEFCON is so strong. And he still is a set piece taker. So I can understand why people think he's a boring pick and I don't own him, for example. But I think the value towards Anderson is ascribed to actually not just the idea that he can get that 4-point or 7-point game, but also I still think he has that ceiling of, stretching towards 10 points, something like, for example, getting an assist from a set piece and then some of the DEFCON actions and then bonus sliced in as we've seen before. So that helps. I think that there's not much of a focal point in terms of the attack of the team. And there are circumstances where, let's say, when Nottingham Forest are doing good, that Anderson will prevail as a really good pick from a bonus perspective too. Somerville, we actually gave him an introduction to the cheat sheet, actually to the top tier last week. It's good that he's kind of renewed, I suppose, the confidence around him. This is a player, of course, who's in extremely hot form, 4 goals in 4 games. And I don't see much signs of him stopping, to be honest. The underlying stats have ticked up massively since Nuno has come into the team. And yes, of course, he's overperforming a fair bit, and I think we can definitely acknowledge that. But he still is clearly a player that it's hard to judge because I still think this is someone who's probably quite prone to circumstance, hasn't had that many Premier League minutes anyways. And so the context is that we can probably be a little bit less judgmental about the underlying stats. As far as Casemiro and Garner, I've given both of them rises. Garner, I probably spoke too soon in terms of maybe his DEFCON numbers dropping after Dewsbury Hall, reinserted himself back into the team, and Gay as well. He's just been exceptional in DEFCON, and he still takes a fair few set pieces. So I still think probably I overstepped the mark a little bit in terms of dropping him. He's just been very, very strong. And I think every week I seem to see that the Seabrit numbers, or the DEFCON numbers, of course, are going up and up and up. For Pascal Gross, I've actually given him a drop. But going back to Casemiro, this is more a case of, once again, I think team strengths sometimes do dictate certain things within the cheat sheet. So if I think, unfortunately, I'm not valuating, let's say, the Brighton team very well, and equally if I'm starting to rate the United team a lot more, that's, an incremental shift that I'll take into account for all the players. But I think Casemiro clearly is just playing exceptionally well. I wouldn't say his DEFCON numbers are completely out of the box, but he's a huge set piece threat as well. And you can kind of look at the NPXG per 90 as a good reflection of that. I mean, he's just proven to be a very efficacious player this season and a key target for the set pieces, right? So yes, of course, I've, for example, bought Maguire for set pieces. Felt like watching the Tottenham game that actually all of them went towards Casemiro, apart from, let's say, the Mbeumo goal. But yeah, I mean, he's just, in a great moment. And I think with Ugarte still seemingly rather unplayable, that's the bonus. I was quite concerned about giving Casemiro a significant rise last week, just because I was a bit concerned about whether Ugarte would, come in a little bit more at 75 minutes, 80 minutes. But I still think that where possible, Casemiro is going to be sort of, I would say, run into the ground a little bit, just because the level of performance and the gap between him and Ugarte is gigantic. With Gross, as I said, that's more of a team strength thing. I also think it's unlikely that he's going to be that much of dominating sort of DEFCON force. I think he's a bit more of a controller in the game, but I don't think he's going to be, an all-action type player in the sense that he's going to get a lot of ball recoveries. So probably overstep the mark a little bit on him, so he does get the drop. In other tiers, not too many differences. I would say in the midfield position, I feel pretty comfortable with how I've placed a lot of the players within the 6 million price bracket. Sure, of course, players like Njai and Ahmad have not been delivering recently, but Ahmad, I think, still has very much satisfied the eye test. Njai has been a little bit dull, I have to be completely honest. I do think part of that is maybe this Everton team are still, struggling from an attacking perspective with the lack of depth that they have. And he is kind of defended as if he was the focal point of the team in open play. But yeah, I mean, I still think that things like penalties are still very valuable. So the cost of NGI is very much worth it. Although you can make the argument that a Garner or a Dewsbury Hall have really just been doing better. And that's kind of the state of FPL at times, where you have these options at a 5 million, 5.5 million price point who are still all capable of getting some super hauls. In the 6.1 sort of yellow tier, I've given Barnes, no changes. I do think he kind of deserves to get a rise, but I do think just the next two games aren't ideal. So I would say Barnes is someone who you'd probably benefit from if this Gordon injury is extended. Now, Howe's quote seems to suggest that Gordon will be coming back soon. So I just think that I can't really afford to give Barnes a higher rise, despite the minutes looking pretty good with the Gordon absence at this moment in time. With Wilson, it's more a case of, I think, waiting for Gameweek 28 to kind of look at him as an option in. With Sobo, he's obviously suspended for Gameweek 26, but I don't think that's a huge issue. He only is suspended for Gameweek 26 because it's DOGSO. It's denial of a goal scoring opportunity. It was not violent conduct. So he will be back very quickly for Gameweek 27. And I think 28 onwards is where Liverpool's run just looks very beautiful. So no real reason to say that he is someone that is an immediate sell at this moment in time. Whereas I think, for example, with someone like Cherki, you're starting to see Marmoush push into getting more left wing minutes. And I think that's a problem for him. But I will also say that City seem to, once again, from an attacking point of view, open themselves a little bit more towards this Liverpool team when Cherki was on the pitch. So I don't think Cherki is someone who's, a bit of a bust in terms of FPL. He just has such an electric ceiling as long as he has good minutes. He's always probably going to be on the cheat sheet because it's not like he's on the complete peripheries like someone like Foden, where even, for example, Nico O'Reilly is, taking precious minutes away from other midfielders within this Man City team, alongside Bernardo Silva, who clearly is Pep's favorite. In that 7 million tier, I wouldn't make too many changes other than I've actually added Bruno G back into the cheat sheet. The issue with Bruno G obviously was always around this injury piece. The big thing whilst Gordon is out is that he's on penalties, which is obviously massive, and he did take advantage of that already within the Premier League this season and did it again within the previous game week. I would say that as a set piece taker, he is quite similar to a lot of the sort of 5 million, 6 million players, but you also kind of have to give credit to what he's done this season. I think some of the open play numbers are actually pretty heartening, but do I think he's a little bit overpriced? Possibly, which is why I'm only comfortable sort of putting him in that yellow tier for now. But I think people can make the same criticism about someone like Rodgers, who I would probably just make the counterpoint just simply has a much cleaner fixture run, from my perspective. As far as, let's say, that next tier, there is some uncertainty around Mbeumo, but I'm not really going to move around Mbeumo and Wirtz. Until Dorgu comes back, I think Cunha's minutes are perfectly safe. It also helps that Sesko and his performances still look extremely lackluster. And in that sort of top tier, Bruno's so close to a price point, I've actually just bucketed him with a Palmer and a Salah for now, and I'm happy to keep him there. What I would probably say is that Palmer is maybe, in very certain circumstances, an interesting transfer, but more of a luxury transfer. I don't really see him, despite having two amazing fixtures back to back, as being a green tier pick, because I do think he is very situational for managers. I actually went to Palmer simply because, as you guys know, I've sort of been funneling as much money as possible towards my midfield, and as a circumstance of that, I had a very cheap defense, which allowed me to go for Palmer, but also have the flexibility to go towards triple Arsenal on a week like this in Gameweek 26. So that's a very sort of certain circumstance. I don't think a lot of people should be suddenly reorganizing their team so that they can get Palmer into their squad. Moving on towards the forwards here, not too many changes once again. I've actually given some drops towards players that I just think aren't really performing up to scratch. Evan Nilsson I've given a soft drop to. I think, yes, of course, he's still in the midst of what is a relatively good fixture run, but I'm not really sure he's on penalties. I also think the quality of fixtures isn't like, a Leeds and a Burnley back-to-back like a João Pedro. Neither is he as solid and rotatable as a Thiago, for example, who just, in my opinion, with guaranteed penalty share, with guaranteed minutes all the time, is always going to be a better option than him. So I'm giving Evan Nilsson a bit of a soft drop here. Bowen as well. This could be harsh, but some of West Ham's fixtures have also come and gone. So really, I think the next two games are actually really good United games, but then after that, there's more than enough reason to start shifting someone like Bowen out of your team. I also kind of wanted to acknowledge Solanke and Havertz, who are both probably going to be interesting differential options going forwards. Havertz is someone who definitely benefits from being able to be positionally quite flexible, and as Odegaard continues to be out, I think he benefits in his stead. With Solanke, we're starting to see sort of a reaccumulation of minutes, and I think it's unfair to sort of judge Solanke on the underlying so far within the Premier League. But I will say that the numbers for Tottenham's attack, or any Tottenham attacker this season, has been extremely bleak. So it's not like I have a lot of confidence in any sort of way with Solanke, despite him, for example, having things like penalties and what will more than likely be better minutes as we go on, and he continues to build up his fitness. I've added Strand Larson within the cheaper tiers, just shifting gears back to that. I think ultimately Strand Larson is a very strong pick, and of course the next two games for Crystal Palace look really good, especially with the likely, I think, conclusion that Mateta is going to be unfit and probably going to opt for a surgical route. At the time of recording this video, I haven't actually looked into the news of this, but I think we were kind of expecting, at least by the Gameweek 26 deadline, to get some news on whether Mateta is going to get surgery. And I think that does help with the Strand Larson case. I do, unfortunately, actually think that Sarr takes penalties, and I think that takes away from some of the value of Strand Larson. He actually had a great chance versus Brighton. So that should be positive signs as you head into two of the easiest fixtures of the season, including sort of a revisiting of his old team in Wolves. But yeah, I like Strand Larson, but honestly, not that much, because you also have to factor in that later down the line, Strand Larson will be worth a transfer, and that's kind of not ideal. I think something to mention in terms of some players to actually think about this week as transfers in would be some of the cheaper players. But this is really, really for the maximum luxury case. Players who kind of have the opportunity to use, maybe when they're at that 3 to 4 transfer stage, of going for a completely luxury transfer. So I would be thinking about things like if you've got a Mark Gu in your team, a Cheeto Obi in your team, if you wanted to move towards a Mane or a Tolu, I think this could make sense, for example, for this Wolves game. But you are really almost using a transfer exclusively for this week. And I suppose at the very sort of best case scenario, this is a player who's much more usable than Gu as bench depth. So something to consider for managers here. Tolu is more of a 9 option. He clearly will have better numbers going forwards as it comes to, for example, things like bookies odds and how he gets predicted to score goals. But Mane's on set pieces. His chances of getting bonus are, I think, in my opinion, maybe not as high because Tolu is still the main goal threat of the team. But I just think that he is almost an all-action player. I like the fact that he's on set pieces. And ultimately, too, he's just a lot cheaper. So he shouldn't really hamper any kind of ability to build on your squad going forwards. As far as that sort of final few tiers of expensive players, in my opinion, Haaland is still at a point where, because the options like Salah are still not really performing towards the level that we would really like, and alternative options like Palmer still have really shaky minutes, And Bruno is actually relatively cheap in the grand scheme of things. I think that has all helped to keep Haaland at the spot that he's at. Ekitike, I've actually given a soft drop to. I can see a lot of people in 2 weeks' time actually thinking Ekitike is going to be a perfect buy in Game Week 28. I'm actually looking, as a manager myself, of thinking that I will probably go for holding Ekitike in my position. But I also feel that it's fair to actually give him a soft drop here because, simply put, he can be sold. There are better players at the midfield position at the same price point of Ekitike, and that's almost how the decision kind of gets crunched, where at that sort of position of, let's say, a Thiago or João Pedro, I still think they're more than justifiable. And you're still shopping, for the most part, I think, for having at least a second striker. I can see some people who've actually increasingly moved into, let's say, having a third striker in their teams. And maybe that's going to be the meta shift in a few weeks' time, because if you don't own, let's say, a Cole Palmer, you absolutely have no reason really to be spending this much money in the game in, let's say, going a 3-5-2 formation. You have enough money to actually probably spread the funds. And instead of going for a 3-4-3, you can basically have a 3-5-3, if that makes sense, where for most weeks, I would say you have a cheaper defense, but then actually you can just choose to play 3-5-2 versus 3-4-3 flexibly. Whereas some people right now are almost exclusively kind of, I think, pinching that midfield spot into someone who's cheap and probably a little bit useless. And in the forward position, actually, we've always had depth options like Krupi Jr. and Mane, where, yes, maybe there's an opportunity to just keep these players because they're actually very solid, or to just move into, a double 7 million mid, who I think also works quite well from a kind of template point of view. Moving towards these defender positions, this is once again another position where I feel like we made a lot of changes last week instead, and I feel very comfortable with where I've situated a lot of players. So where I have players from United, I feel pretty comfortable with them. The drop down for the Sunderland players, I think, was fair, but they're still very strong. Leeds, once again, options are getting DEFCON, although Strauch, I just want to mention, it seems to have something wrong with his hip flexor, so he's likely to miss out this upcoming game. Otherwise, we have options like, for example, the opportunity to reassess Brentford very, very shortly. So we have had Collins bench for a couple of games, so you can see in the 5 million plus tier that he actually has dropped, but I have not, for example, conversely given, let's say, Ayer and Vandenberg a rise. I think the point here is that you can just wait for the Arsenal game to kind of allow yourself to reassess what is going on exactly with this Brentford team. But keep in mind, of course, with Keith Andrews, I think if I could probably say something for him this season, it does seem like he's very comfortable just simply shifting on his center backs. We went from basically Vandenberg versus Collins for the large parts of the season to Vandenberg having a very soft injury and then actually getting immediately displaced by Ayer for a couple of weeks. And then the same thing happened with Ayer, where Vandenberg came onto the pitch and suddenly he starts the next game with Ayer and Vandenberg. So it seems like maybe Collins has an issue, but I don't think we've seen much reported on it. However, I will also say that I watched, I think, Brentford versus Nottingham Forest, and Igor Jesus did seem to have a pretty easy chance at scoring a goal when he scored his pretty good sort of half volley shot versus Collins. I do wonder if Keith Andrews is a bit temperamental. I can't really criticize him because he's had just an exceptional Premier League season for a first-time Premier League manager. So there's really not much to say. He's completely bossing the league. He knows better than me. But something to think about in terms of, can you get a cheaper Brentford defender? Or, does Collins even have any utility going forward? So hard to say. In those kind of higher price points at the 5 million tier, I've given Calafiori a rise. I do think he'll play both games in the double. I could be wrong, but I just think that he does add a little bit more on the kind of attacking element of things compared towards a Hincapié. I think Arteta's option or, chance to, let's say, play Calafiori for 2 60-minute games is right there. The FA Cup being sandwiched in between the double also means that most likely he's going to be rested for the right fixtures and to be playing and starting for the good ones. At his price point, with the gap that he has over, let's say, a Timber and a Gabriel, I think it's more than justified to actually consider a Calafiori if that 0.8 million, or arguably that 1.7 million, can be a huge difference in terms of squad construction in the future. Would I consider him as a captaincy option? Not necessarily, but I think he's a very solid pick if you're kind of looking for someone who actually, fills your team out for the double and then actually can be a really solid option for yourself going forwards. Lacroix also gets a rise. This is mostly just Palace related. I would have loved to, let's say, give, Richards and Munoz massive rises and kind of think that they're the best picks in the game. I think it's as simple as Burnley and Wolves at home is that good. So this is why the Palace players are going up. I think very, very shortly you'll see that they'll also go down, but this is just what happens in a game where in reality, like just like Chelsea's next 2 games, you have 2 perfect fixtures, and you really want to take advantage of that as much as you can. I can't necessarily have the luxury of going for Munoz, but I congratulate any manager who's got the opportunity to do so and wish them the best of luck. As far as Teo, I've given him a bit of a soft drop. I still really like Hall's numbers. Teo clearly has been a really good set piece throughout the season as well, and his DEFCON numbers are good, but I don't think they're that exceptional. And in my opinion, too, I don't think Newcastle are massively, far behind, let's say, a team like Liverpool or City in terms of the defensive quality. But some of the recent performances are still a little bit more alarming. And I'm not 100% certain that I love Newcastle's fixture run anyways, which is why I've given Cho a drop, because I think a lot of people maybe will be facing with the decisions of actually selling one of the 2 players if they own 2 Newcastle defenders. And the player that I definitely would want to keep is someone like Hall. Not to mention that in Gameweek 31, actually, when we roll around towards that blind game week, and it's actually quite soon, that Newcastle defenders will be a very good option to kind of own for that sort of dead end fixture. So that's kind of it for the defenders as well. And then in terms of the goalkeepers, we've added Jose Sa just because he's the differential option, just for the purposes of this double game week. I don't really love the Jose Sa move unless, once again, you're in this position where you already own triple Arsenal, you don't own Raya, and suddenly you do want to have a goalkeeper here for the double. That could be interesting. But keep in mind, of course, one of these goalkeepers does play versus Arsenal, so it's not ideal. But I can see the value of it if you just have, as I said, somewhere between 3 to 5 transfers, and it actually could be really worthwhile. Henderson gets a small little rise for me, once again, fixture related, and Rose gets a bit of a drop just because of fixtures too. So when you kind of look at the teams, as I said, in this Premier League season, after, for example, Newcastle, Liverpool, and City, the quality in defense, once again, has a huge drop. And of course, these teams are massively separated against a team like Arsenal, who are far, far clear of the rest of the field. But between, let's say, I guess, the defensive quality of maybe, I don't know, maybe a team like, let's say, Tottenham or a Palace, who are quite close to Liverpool and Newcastle, there is a massive gulf in terms of XGC with the rest, but they're all bunched up in the middle of the table. So I think there's not too much really separating a lot of the teams. It's mostly the fixtures at any point in time. And with goalkeepers, they're a little bit more fixture proof just because you'll be holding for much longer fixture runs. So that's just something to mention. But we're in a pretty good stable spot within the game. And that's going to be it for the cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching. See you guys soon, and best of luck with this double Gaming 26. Let me know if you're planning to do a triple captaincy on Gabriel, because I'd be quite interested to see what your thoughts are. Otherwise, as I said, take care and goodbye. And do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already and you're enjoying the content.